Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk It Out and Find Out, the podcast where we dive into everything that's on your mind. Join me, your host, Dee Lene, as we keep it real, keep it casual, and explore today's trendiest topics. Whether you're looking for solutions, insights, and a little inspiration, this is the space where curiosity meets conversation. So I just got back from London, traveling for personal business and for pleasure. And I wanted to share how much of a wonderful time I had. I went to see one of my favorite vocalists, Liz Wright, who I had been wanting to see for years, but she never comes to the States. So you usually have to travel out of the country to see her. And the reason I wanted to see her so bad was because I recall a conversation I had with a friend about 20 years ago. And she shared her music with me for the first time. And she was telling me how she attended her concert in Atlanta and how spiritual and redefining it was. And she told me that if I ever got a chance to see her live, it would be a life-changing experience. And she assured me I would not be disappointed. And I believed her. And believe me, I wasn't disappointed at all. As a matter of fact, it was profoundly encouraging and something that I will never forget. And I wish I could always feel that way, but unfortunately, I also know how it feels on the other side of things to be disappointed and discouraged. Now, disappointment and discouragement are quiet but powerful forces, and they creep in when reality doesn't align with our hopes and when efforts don't yield reward. So, it also creeps in when the world feels different to our striving. So disappointment is that sting or unmet expectation, and it reminds us that we cared or that we tried to care or that we even tried. On the other hand, discouragement lingers longer, and it's not just about what happened, but what might not ever happen again. So it tempts us to stop or to question our worth or to even shrink ourselves. But both also carry meaning. They signal that we are invested, that something mattered to us. They can be crossroads, either cracks that let doubt seep in or pressure points that strengthen resolve. And the key isn't always avoiding disappointment or discouragement. They're part of our path. So we wouldn't want to avoid them. So it's worth walking, but learning to meet them with patience, perspective, and a stubborn kind of hope. Disappointment and discouragement are companions of anyone who dares to care deeply or to hope sincerely, and they come with the package. So, philosophically, they are evidence of our humanity and of the gap between the ideal and the real. So, we form visions of how we think our life should unfold, our values should be shaped, our dreams and our desires, and even our visions. When they collapse, we are faced not only with external failure, but an internal unraveling. And it reminds us that the world is not obligated to align with our intentions. And this can be both disappointing and discouraging. Personally, discouragement can feel like standing still in a storm, and even small steps seem heavy. And it can whisper to us that our efforts are futile and maybe we're just not enough, and that perhaps it's safer not to want so much in life. But to feel discouraged is also to reveal that we once believed, and belief, however bruised, is a profound strength. Now, to me, there's something quietly heroic about continuing when things feel pointless. But to rise from discouragement without clarity or try again without guarantee, that's where the real courage lies. And I talk a lot about courage because sometimes we avoid doing things because of lack of courage, but it usually means there is an absence of pain or failure, and it's a choice to live honestly in the face of them. So, in spite of having that lack of courage and enduring or having to endure the pain of failure, you still move forward with things. And when viewed through the lens of faith and growth, disappointment and discouragement take on a deeper, almost sacred meaning. They become less like dead ends and more like thresholds. And they're places where the soul can be stretched, tested, and in time, the soul becomes, or your person becomes transformed. So in faith, especially disappointment, it can feel unbearable. So we pray, we believe, we act, and we hope. And yet still the outcome is that if we fall short, doors start closing, silence lingers, and it can shape the foundation, and it makes us stop and think to ourselves, why would a good and loving God allow this pain, this delay, or even loss? But mature and honest faith, rather, doesn't deny the reality of suffering. It leans into it, and it trusts that there is meaning, even when meaning isn't visible. And that can make it feel like absence may be a kind of presence too deep for words. So, growth rarely happens in comfort. It's always going to be uncomfortable. And I'm familiar with this feeling because I've been uncomfortable for years in my growth periods and still feel remnants of discomfort all the time. However, the soil must be broken for seeds to take root. And in the same way, discomfort often digs into our illusion of control and of timing and of who we think we should be. So invite yourself to let go and also to grow in trust, resilience, and humility. It's painful, yes, but it's also clarifying. And we begin to learn the difference between ego driven striving and soul shaped becoming. So let's break that down and reflect on what that means, what those two statements mean. What does ego driven striving mean? Because this is a new phrase for me. So I'm sure most of us are not familiar with it. So, ego driven striving is the kind of effort or ambition that comes from a deep need to prove something about our worth or even our importance or our place in the world. And it's not inherently bad because we all want to be seen, valued, and or successful, but it can become exhausting or even self-destructive when it starts to control how we live or how we make choices or how we define ourselves. So when ego-driven strife rooted in fear or insecurity or fear of being seen as a failure or fear of being invisible or just not being enough. We push ourselves not necessarily because we feel called or inspired, but because we feel like we must earn approval, attention, or even just gain some identity from somewhere. So, some examples of ego driven striving might look like this. One is achieving to feel like you're finally worthy. Another is saying yes to everything because you just don't want to disappoint or seem incapable of something. Also, comparing your life constantly to others and feeling like you're behind the curve, or defining yourself only by what you accomplish or how you are perceived by others. And another is feeling anxious when you're not doing enough or when you feel you're not progressive enough or you're just progressing too slow. Now, two of these resonate with me. And the first one is saying yes to everything because you just don't want to disappoint or seem incapable. I would say yes because I wanted to prove I could do or be certain things, when the truth is, I probably didn't even care to be involved, or it was just simply something I wasn't interested in, it wasn't my thing. So I learned that it is okay to say no to things that I was not comfortable with, and that it's okay to just be my true, authentic self. The next one is feeling anxious when you're not doing enough or when you're not progressing at the pace that you feel you should or others feel you should. But I learned that your progress in life is your progress and it belongs to you. There's no time limit on how you grow or how your value is perceived by others. In contrast, soul driven or purpose driven striving comes from a place of inner alignment. So you're still working hard, but not to prove your value. Instead, you're living from it. There's more peace there, more clarity, more trust and timing. And you're less shaken by setbacks because your identity isn't riding on the outcome. So letting go of ego driven striving doesn't mean letting go of ambition. It just simply means letting go of the need to hustle for your worth. I like that word hustle. I like the way it sounds because it's an action word. It's like you're doing something. And believe me, you will feel better about yourself if you live by those words. It's a shift from striving to become something and to live from the truth that you already are something deeply valuable. Now, that belief starts with you. Let's deep dive into what soul shaped becoming means because, again, these are new terms to me. And from what I read, soul shaped becoming is a beautiful, slow, and often hidden kind of transformation. It's the process of growing into who you truly are and not the person that the world expects or fears or tries to mold, but the person your soul was made to be. Where ego driven striving is about performance, image, and achievement, soul shaped becoming is about authenticity, depth, and alignment with truth. It's not about constructing a life that looks successful. It's about living a life that feels true to who you are at your core. So, soul shaped becoming often begins in places of disruption, disappointment, and discouragement, and even failure, because those quiet, broken spaces that ego starts to loosen its grip. The soul, in contrast to the ego, is patient. It doesn't rush, it listens, it seeks meaning over approval, and it values being rather than overdoing. Now, this becoming isn't loud or linear. It might look like learning to rest without guilt or choosing forgiveness over resentment. Also, letting go of roles or dreams that no longer fit where you are at the moment. Al- Uh, another one is saying no to good things to make space for right things, trusting silence instead of forcing answers, and finally embracing vulnerability instead of performing strength. So these are reshaping mechanisms for who you are striving to become. Now, disappointment may strip away what we thought we wanted, only to lead us toward what we truly need. And discouragement, when met with faith, becomes less of a wall and more of a mirror, showing us not only our limits, but our strengths. Faith and growth, when intertwined with disappointment and discouragement, form a tension that is both difficult and, in contrast, also beautiful. The essence of growth lies not in the absence of struggle, but in the way we respond to it. So the journey to growth is never smooth. There's always an upward climb. It's more like the slow and deliberate process of a tree gaining strength in the wind, its roots anchoring deeper in response to every storm. So we all have heard or seen or experienced trees being uprooted, and we know how that looks. But if the roots of that tree are strong, it's immovable. And not even a strong wind can uproot it. So my relationship with disappointment always lies in my relationships with others, my family, my romantic relationships, and my friendships. That's where all my experience with disappointment and discouragement has or does happen. I think this happens because I always invest more in others than they are willing to invest in me. And that's not how that should work. My investment in these relationships are intentional, but for me, it's the betrayal that gets me. And also when you figure out that that same betrayal was actually intentional. When people know they don't appreciate who and what you are, but still deal with you, or shall I say, tolerate you, how disappointing it is to find out that those type of people are just not that into you and that they're not your people. That's what you need to realize. They're not your people. So what do you do with that? Well, that's where the discouragement comes in for me. I feel like if you are not fond of a person, why waste your time with making a connection? I'll tell you why. Because when people display this behavior, it's usually because they are hiding from what they need to fix within themselves. So they use others as fillers. And I know this from personal experience because when I did work on myself, I realized the same things I didn't like in others were some of the same things I didn't like in myself. I also realized that most of the people that I dealt with at that time in my life, I wasn't really that fond of them anyway. And I digress. But I simply wanted to make the point of how disappointment and discouragement can cause a disastrous spiral of incomplete feelings. If we look at the example of Job from religious texts, we can see a figure who experiences unimaginable suffering, loss, and or confusion. Now, Job's faith isn't a blind optimism, it's a raw and messy process of grappling with disappointment. And yet, through his suffering, he grows not in comfort or understanding, but in intimacy with something deeper than his circumstances. And in the end, he finds that his faith was not about securing rewards, but about being in a relationship with the divine through every high and every low. Wow, this is such a good example of loyalty as well, because what was most important to Job was his relationship with God, not what he was going to eventually get out of it. Now, his growth came from a deeper awareness of who he was in the face of suffering, not in despite of it. So, in comparison, growth in the personal sense often requires us to confront our vulnerabilities and our limitations. So we learn most about who we are and what we truly need when these things are broken, not when things are whole. Growth comes from the soil of discomfort, cultivated by the quiet endurance of continuing on despite feelings of discouragement. So it's easy to mistake growth for success, but growth is subtle. Growth is an internal process. It's the refinement of character, the honing of wisdom, the quiet persistence that leads us back to a place of renewal. And often, disappointment and discouragement become the very soil in which growth takes root. And it teaches us to surrender our need for control, our desire for perfection. And in that surrender, we become more authentically who we are meant to be. We grow through our trials not by avoiding them. Now, the discomfort of discouragement offers us a profound opportunity for recalibration, a chance to ask deeper questions about our true desires, motivations, and capabilities. Also, to grow is not to outgrow challenges, but to grow through them, learning to walk in faith, not in absence of fear or disappointment, but in spite of it. So it's not trading one for the other, but rather learning to use faith as a buffer. There's a profound shift that happens in this space. Identity becomes less about what am I producing and how am I being perceived, and more about what kind of person am I becoming. Growth then isn't external, it's spiritual. It's becoming someone who can hold both joy and sorrow, faith and doubt, hope and grief all at once. It's the development of a soul that's not easily shaken because it knows its roots go deeper than circumstances. And here's the mystery in that. In these seasons of identity being reshaped by disappointment, you may feel the most uncertain, but you are also often the closest to your truest self. So, in conclusion, disappointment and discouragement, though painful, are not signs of failure, they are sacred invitations. They call us to pause, to reflect, and let go of illusions that once defined our sense of worth or direction. In the stillness, they create something deeper that begins to take root, a quiet trust, a clearer identity, and a more grounded faith. Now, these moments, though unwelcomed, often become thresholds to soul shaped becoming. So we know what that means now. And that's where we stop striving to prove and start learning to be. And in that space, we discover that growth is not always marked by visible progress, but by the quiet resilience to keep going and the courage to become who we were always meant to be. Thank you for tuning in to Let's Talk It Out and Find Out. We appreciate you spending your time with us. Be sure to subscribe by hitting the follow button or wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode. We'll be back next week with more great content. See you then.